Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's Jack Slack here. This is the Fights Gone By history episode. I will think of an alternative name for the history episodes we do for the Patreon boys. I haven't thought of that yet, but this episode is entitled An Un-American Trilogy. And this episode, I stumbled upon the idea for this while researching the second episode, which will be coming out in a week or two, on Jack Johnson, that whole debacle, the first black heavyweight champion of the world, and how he was treated by American society, and how he behaved, to be honest, too, because he was an abrasive personality by all accounts. But that entire debacle, I think is the right word, was absolutely fascinating and makes a great story all of its own. But in the course of researching that, I discovered this article from the Washington Post, 1913. It's called Few Stars of Prize Ring of Native American Stock. And in the course of this piece, the author asserts that of the heavyweight champions of the world to that point, only one had been an American. Now, by 1913, there have been 5 heavyweight champions of the world, according to the new... well, we'll get into this later today, but the champion of the world moniker under the gloved Marquess of Queensberry rules. But there have been 5 heavyweight champions of the world: John L. Sullivan, James J. Corbett, Bob Fitzsimmons, Jim Jeffries, Jack Johnson. Now the problem is that all 4 of those would be called American by most people today, and this author makes an argument for only one of those being American. So today we're going to be talking about the Un-American Trilogy, the first 3, and they're dealing with stigmas and their lives, and a little bit on their fighting styles, because we do have a bit of film, and I'm really looking forward to this working into the modern era in these episodes. We will be able to use more film, because the great thing about old film is that there's no one watching the rights on it and looking to take you down at every turn. But also, you get this look into an old style that has some lessons for today, but also has a great deal of stuff that is just completely foreign to today's fighting. Now, I always like to start these episodes with a little thought exercise, so I'm going to ask you to do one now. I want you to imagine that you are the editor and owner of a major mixed martial arts news website. We're gonna stay current with this. Now, I want you to imagine that you have met Conor McGregor, maybe 2014. I think that's when I met him. Yeah, 2014. He's starting his rise to popularity, and something about him just rubs you the wrong way. I mean, there's plenty of things that he could say that rub you the wrong way, but something about him pisses you off. And you're a big deal in this sport. You are the owner of MMA fighting, or MMA Junkie, or Fight Loud. I don't want to annoy one editor because I know most of them, but you're the owner of one of these places, and this Conor McGregor guy is pissing you off, and you would love to just not cover him and not give him the column inches and not give him the attention, but he keeps knocking people out, and they're good people, and everyone else is talking about him. So you begrudgingly have to talk about him and cover his fights. So what you might do is start, praising him when he wins, but then say, I think the real champion is this lad over here. Maybe McGregor then beats that guy, and you go, well, that's okay, but I think this new guy out of wherever, he's the new big deal. I'll believe that McGregor's the best when he beats him. And this is what happened when John L. Sullivan was making his rise through the ranks of American boxing, well, world boxing at that time. At some point, John L. Sullivan met a man named Richard K. Fox, who was the owner and proprietor with a capital P of the National Police Gazette. Now, we've covered Richard K. Fox a little in the past, and there is no denying that he's an important part of fighting history, boxing history especially. It's also hard to deny that he was a bit of a scumbag, but we'll get on to that. He was born in Belfast in 1846, and he emigrates to America when he becomes an adult. Around the 1800s, you have mass emigration from Ireland to the United States, by sea into the ports of Boston and New York especially, or anything on the East Coast gained something of an Irish community, and those two cities especially gained enormous Irish communities. And the reason for this emigration was the potato famine. In continuous failure of crops in Ireland, Ireland's staple crop was the potato, and something like 2/3 of all crops in Ireland grown at the time were potatoes. So when the crops failed, essentially there was not enough food to feed almost anyone, and the handling of it by Britain was exceptionally poor. There's some historians have called it a borderline genocide. The lack of response from the British government to Ireland's famine. But over the course of the 1800s, if you're familiar with the potato famine, the statistics on population of Ireland are just staggering. The population of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland today, the entirety of the island of Ireland, is still recovering from the potato famine. That's how many people died or left. So, real reason to leave Ireland at the time. Obviously, Britain very unwelcoming, America unwelcoming, but a large nation still in its growing phases. And of course, there were all the stories of the streets paved with gold and all that sort of stuff. Peak year for Irish immigration to the US is 1851, when almost 250,000 Irish people emigrated into the US. Now, Fox arrives on the East Coast in 1874. He's the generation after the massive boom in immigration from Ireland, the generation after Sullivan's parents, and we'll be talking about them in a minute. But he arrives almost penniless, and he's a true rags to riches story. He begins writing for the National Police Gazette, which at the time was a failing publication. It had been founded a year before he was born in 1845, and the owners had made a success of it by covering basically crime almost exclusively. The grislier the better, and they made sure that this publication was supplied to almost every barbershop that they could find in the New York area. And it did well as a rag. But the owners wound up making poor investments and ended up flat broke. They ended up selling it to a guy called Matzel, George Matzel, and he had no idea how to run the paper, and it slowly declined from there on. The sale of the paper took place in 1857. By the time Fox got there, there was almost nothing left, which is why a penniless immigrant was able to take the job writing for them. And what Richard K. Fox did was essentially invent the sports page. He realised that if he wanted to appeal to common people, he had to give them the things they wanted. And what America was crying out for was coverage of sports. Now, the main sports of the day were baseball and boxing was illegal in most places. But that didn't matter to Fox. He wanted to cover the most raunchy, lowbrow, common denominator stuff that he could. And over the years, he was able to supply the paper nationally, where it had previously been a regional paper, built himself a huge fortune, built an office in New York City, gave himself the title of proprietor rather than editor-in-chief, and very famously, he would fund his own sporting events so that he could write about them later. And he did all sorts of weird things like, competitive winkle eating. He wrote a book, which I linked in an article a while back, called Breeding Gamecocks. Anything that he could call a sport, he called a sport. But the thing that was grabbing the attention at the time was boxing. There's a lot of references to this so-called cult of masculinity, but boxing was a massively popular pastime with the Irish immigrants and the children of Irish immigrants. Within the Irish community, boxing was where it was at. And the champion by 1880 was a man called Paddy Ryan, who was an immigrant from Tipperary. So within the Irish community, boxing was a huge deal, and they were a large part of Fox's demographic. Now, throughout the John L. Sullivan story, Richard K. Fox is going to be sort of Sullivan's biggest rival. Essentially, Fox would drag up the new contenders, back them with his own money as a side bet against Sullivan, and hope that Sullivan would lose. Now, John L. Sullivan was the child of Irish immigrants. His father came over in 1850, the year before the peak of Irish immigration to the US. His name was Mike Sullivan, and he was in no way an indication of the heavyweight champion of the world. You would have no idea that would spring forth from his loins, because he was about 5'3" and weighed barely over 100 pounds. He was not a big man at all, even though he spent his entire life as a labourer. And this is something that you have to get used to when you're reading these old accounts. Heavyweight champions are not even close to the size they are today. And, this all combines with the need for proper nutrition and things like that. People are generally getting a lot taller, but also consider that most of the boxers of the day came from the working classes. You got people like Jack Dempsey, who would regularly go for days without food while they were growing up. Very, very poor people, and those are not ideal circumstances for raising a great fighter, or a great athlete, or even like a very healthy person. At any rate, Mike Sullivan and his wife Catherine, who was a rather big woman by all accounts, and most people suspect that Sullivan's size comes from that side of the family. They have 3 children: Mike, Annie, and John, or John Lawrence, shortened later to John L. In fact, a lot of his fans could barely remember, or didn't even know what the L stood for. He was just the great John L. Now, the plan for John was the same as a lot of old Irish families back in Ireland. You have one son go into the seminary. John L. Sullivan was supposed to find his vocation, but he did a couple of months, by most accounts, at Boston College in training for it. Didn't like it, dropped out. And then this is where things get interesting. He becomes an apprentice plumber. Doesn't that sound familiar? Doesn't like that, packs it in. Basically, his story is similar to Mendoza's. Every job that he's sort of gifted a way into, he finds a way of falling out with the person in charge and getting kicked out on his arse. But he was a keen sportsman, and one of the main sports of the day, as we already mentioned, was baseball. And he was a decent semi-professional baseballer. He was offered a decent contract for that in Cincinnati. Now, the fascinating thing about Sullivan is that this is an era where ringcraft of a sort already exists. And most who saw Sullivan, there are compliments of his craft and science, but most people who saw him and gave accounts are mainly just astonished at the power. John L. Sullivan might have been the most talented knockout specialist to ever live, because he was fighting people who knew how to tie up and how to deal with the stuff that he was bringing, and he was still knocking them out. He was most famous for his overhand or cross counter, looping right across the top of the jab. He had a decent right straight. But by the account of Mike Donovan, who was a really interesting character, he wrote a book later in life called, I can't remember what it was called, something like Teddy Roosevelt and Other Fighting Men I've Known. But he had a sparring contest with Sullivan at one point, and he basically said Sullivan's style was to swing his right hand, and he was so powerful he could just strip your block away with it and go right through. Sullivan gets famous by issuing these challenges. He goes across America and he says that he will, and the prize money gets bigger and bigger as it goes on, but he'll give $100 as it starts out to anyone who can last 4 rounds with him. And this is where Sullivan's preference for gloves comes in. He was the last champion to win the lineal London prize ring rules belt, or title rather, bare knuckle. And then he continued to defend in the gloves. And the gloves are important for the challenge because 4 rounds bare knuckle London prize rules is 4 knockdowns, or 4 times the guy takes a knee. The 4-round challenge only really works if you're working with time periods, and the guy has to keep standing up and taking the punches. So a lot of Sullivan's appeal was in these supposed exhibitions where he'd go from town to town offering to take on anyone in the gloves. And Sullivan very much preferred the gloves, by all accounts. He didn't actually like the bare knuckle stuff. He didn't like wrestling for a start. A lot of criticism of his wrestling through his career. There's a great account, can't remember where it's from, but they basically said before the Kilrain fight that they expected Kilrain to wrestle him to tiredness because Sullivan wasn't a very good wrestler. That was a bare knuckle fight. Obviously wrestling's a big deal in that. Later on, Corbett does a good job of tying him up whenever he wants. But it's this power that is Sullivan's trump all card. And the feats that he was able to perform against, even talented boxers back then, make you wonder if he was one of the hardest hitters ever, basically, or at least one of the most gifted in landing his heavy hits. So Sullivan fights a guy called John Flood on a barge in New York in 1881, and he starts to really build his reputation from then. Falls in with a guy called Billy Madden, and later with William Muldoon, the great wrestler, who would later become the first chairman of the New York State Athletic Commission. Very important guy. So in 1882, Fox matches Sullivan and Paddy Ryan. He backs Paddy Ryan, and the fight is declared to be within 100 miles of New Orleans. New Orleans was a decent fight town for a while, but the governor decided that he was going to crack down on this, and he said that they'd break up the fight if it came anywhere near it. So the fight gets moved to a hotel in Mississippi City, which I'd never heard of until I read the accounts. So not a particularly important place compared to New Orleans, but over the state border, so a little bit safer, even though the governor there spoke out about it too. Now, by most accounts, Paddy Ryan was on the way down. Some people have him becoming more interested in business and becoming a saloon owner. Other people have him on the edge of destitution. It depends what account you read. In fact, you'll read some stories of John L. Sullivan splitting his purse with Ryan after the fight because Ryan was so poor. But then in the press, there was still bickering between the two of them. So, you don't know how likely these stories are. But the astonishing thing is that Paddy Ryan is an ultra-experienced fighter, and Sullivan decks him in under 11 minutes. Bare-knuckle rule, so you can go down as many times as you want, you just have to come back up to the mark. Hits him with a sneaker right out of the clinch to put him down for the last time. And just like that, he's the bare-knuckle champion of America. Now, the two had drawn 5,000 people to a hotel in the middle of nowhere, basically. So, you get a sense of how popular boxing is becoming, even as a spectator sport. Now, when you consider the lack of film at the time, and you begin to understand how important the coverage in the press is. If the press collectively decided not to cover this sport, it wouldn't be anything at this point. But the fact that the Herald and the Globe and the Police Gazette are covering this sport means that it continues growing. And it also means that, people aren't going to get a realistic assessment of John L. Sullivan's skills or Paddy Ryan's skills. What they're going to get is a hyperbolic account of how brilliantly strong or wickedly fast John L. Sullivan is. And, it would be very rare to see the heavyweight champion in person, in action. Now, what is fascinating about Sullivan is that whether he was mechanically sound or not, he didn't have much formal training. He travelled around with sparring partners and did exhibitions with them and, would be sparring with them regularly. But he didn't have a teacher, and most of what he did seems to be self-learned. Now, our theme today was un-Americanness, or alleged un-Americanness. And Sullivan was the son of two Irish immigrants. He was essentially Irish, but he was fiercely patriotic about being American all his life. His father was very much a patriotic Irishman. Allegedly, he'd insist that there were tons of men in Ireland who could beat John. And John L. Sullivan is credited as a sort of transitionary figure for the Irish in America. When he died, he was called the noblest Roman of them all by a couple of papers. That one always stuck with me because the Roman thing, he's not actually Roman, it's a Catholic thing. And the Catholic thing seemed to be a lot of the prejudice against Irish people. Obviously, Ireland was staunchly Catholic at the time. America very much a Protestant nation. As we mentioned before, John was supposed to go into the seminary and become a priest. And if you read any of these anti-Irish articles from the time, a lot of it is critical of the failure of the Irish to integrate by keeping themselves separate in their staunch Catholicism. Through the 1800s, we're seeing a rise in race science, things like phrenology, things where you can take an ethnic group or a national group and build an allegedly scientific reason for them to be inferior. I read one newspaper article referring to Irish people as Negroes turned inside out. If you can imagine how badly black people were treated at the time, that'll give you an idea of how little respect a lot of people in especially the East Coast cities had for the Irish. There was a lot of animosity between the Irish and the black communities because often they competed for the same very low jobs. Very famously, the sign "No Irish Need Apply" was hung outside shops and workplaces. And John L. Sullivan, for whatever he did through being, the great quote is always the emperor of masculinity. Whatever great work he did through being the great John L., he didn't fight a lot of stereotypes. In the same way that Jack Johnson was brash and in your face, and didn't do what Joe Louis later had to do and play down his blackness. John L. Sullivan never played down his Irishness, and in fact he conformed to a lot of the very negative stereotypes that the Irish had around them at the time. His drinking was legendary. The phrase goes that he earned over $1 million in his life, and he gave more than half of it away buying drinks for people and sharing drinks. He could tell a mean story. He was the most animated person in the world in the pub or the bar. People loved him for his stories and his laughs and his generosity with his money, but his drinking really affected him poorly. Shortly after the Paddy Ryan fight in April of 1882, his lungs rupture, allegedly as a result of his drinking, but for a while it seems like he's on his deathbed. And he doesn't learn from this. He is told that it's due to drinking, and he continues to drink with the same vigour. If you get a chance to read his training schedule for his second nationwide tour, I believe it was, firstly, it's really interesting that there's not a lot of running in fighting at this time. He walks 12 miles in the morning, 6 out and 6 back, and he jogs the last half mile. And then he does the same again in the evening. So he's doing 24 miles a day, but he's only running a mile, which is a crazy schedule to keep if you're on tour and training and sparring every day too. But in between that, his diet is like, I had a big steak and just some whiskey or just a light beer or something like that. Drinking was just a part of his life, and to be honest, it was part of most people's lives at this time, but it was more a part of John L's than most. The other side of the negative stereotypes is that Sullivan and his first wife did not get along at all. He was apparently a very abusive husband, physically and emotionally. They had a son, but he died very young. Very sad story. They separated, and they didn't get a formal divorce for a very long time. But they separated in under 2 years after being married. Now, this hatred of training and love of drink was ultimately going to be Sullivan's downfall, along with the fact that his fighting strategy was just to go at the opponent from the first bell and hit them as many times as he needed to until the fight was over. Even in the day, they were pointing to his lack of ring science, but no one could do anything about it. So it was sort of a Ronda Rousey situation where, as no one can do anything about it, there's no point talking about it. So he has a few fights, like an exhibition against a guy called Tug Wilson, and Wilson survives the 4 rounds by running from him, basically, making that challenge look a little bit less dangerous than it used to. He fights Charlie Mitchell a couple of times, who's a British boxer, and Mitchell is able to exhaust Sullivan over the course of their second fight, and the fight is eventually declared a draw, though both are essentially too tired to do anything. But in 1889, Sullivan finally gets to fight a guy called Jake Kilrain, and Richard K. Fox has declared Jake Kilrain his champion. He's made up a champion of the world belt, one of the very first world championship belts, and he's given it to Kilrain. Sullivan knows this is a serious fight. He's had trouble with opponents running away from him before or tiring him out over the distance. The Charlie Mitchell fight wasn't particularly good for him and his image in that regard. So he goes to train with Muldoon, the wrestler, who tries to whip him into the best shape of his life. And Muldoon keeps him away from the booze. It's his job to just keep Sullivan off the drink and whip him into shape, make sure he actually makes it to the fight, not bulging over his trousers as he had been in recent years. Once again, the fight is in Mississippi because New Orleans, the governor, is cracking down on bare-knuckle fights. And over the course of 75 rounds, Kilrain and Sullivan go at it. And Sullivan throws up midway through, and Kilrain backs away from him doesn't want to get vomit all over himself, and asks if Sullivan wants to quit, and Sullivan just keeps going, keeps grunting, keeps throwing punches. 75th round, Kilrain's corner finally throw in the sponge, as that was the thing in the day. You hold up the sponge if you want to lose, or if you want out, rather. And Sullivan is consensus the champion of the world at that point. And when offered Richard K. Fox's belt, he famously said that he wouldn't hang that thing around the neck of a damn dog. And instead he was given a $10,000 belt, which was allegedly from the citizens of Boston. So I don't know if they had a whip around for that, but it had world champion spelled out in diamonds, beginning a grand tradition of boxers liking things garish. Though John L. was, by all accounts, a bit of a dandy. Every story about meeting him in the street from any sort of experienced writer or anything like that always gives an account of what he was wearing. And it's things like robin egg blue trousers or pantaloons and some kind of colourful top hat. And it seems as though John L. loved celebrity. He just enjoyed people knowing who he was and liking him. He goes on stage in a play called Kind Hearts and Willing Hands, and the accounts of him in papers at the time are quite fun, because they all try and find a clever way of not saying that he was shit, but that he wasn't very good. But this is a little bit of what most fighters, or most ultra successful fighters, have fallen into since, using the fighting to get into what is hopefully another career. Unfortunately, very few are good actors, but people are willing to pay for that if he's an ultra celebrity. Sullivan was probably the most famous person in America at the time, so people were more than willing to shell out the money to come and see him. Similarly, when Sugar Ray Robinson retired from the ring for whatever number time it was, he became the highest paid tap dancer in the world on his opening night, because people wanted to see Sugar Ray Robinson. They didn't care that he wasn't a very good tap dancer. So Sullivan's away from the ring for 3 years, and during that time a young man comes up where John L. Sullivan was the transitionary champion. He fought in the bare knuckle and the gloves. This young man only fought in the gloves. He was the first world champion later to only fight in the gloves, or to not have fought under London prize rules. And he was also the son of Irish immigrants. He was from a slightly better standing. His parents owned a successful livery stable, and he was one of 11 children. And his name was James J. Corbett, the man who would become Gentleman Jim. James Corbett is fascinating for a very similar reason to Dominic Cruz. In fact, he really does remind me of Dominic Cruz when you see him moving. Corbett was one of the first fighters to really utilise movement to maintain the distance between himself and his opponent, and fight from a distance where they couldn't hit him and he'd have to leap in to hit them. So what he was very good at was feinting and darting in and out. In fact, if we talk a little bit about styles here, what we know about John L. Sullivan is that he loved his overhand, that he could hit with both hands. Later, he wrote a column called Jolts with John L., which was absolutely hilarious. Every anecdote ended with so I showed him what for, and I had the last laugh. But he insisted that he had a great lead hand. If you see the footage of him at, I believe it's Jeffries' camp, ahead of the Jim Jeffries-Jack Johnson fight, which there is a great story about him and Corbett falling out there too, supposedly the last time they ever spoke. But there is a footage of him milling his hands, doing the windmill motion, pulling the left hand back as he waves the right hand downward in front of his face, and then rotating them, and showing how that motion can hide the lead and the right hand. And that was a lot of early boxing, and we don't suspect that was so much a London prize ring thing, but it came in towards the end of that era. The circling of the hands in the sort of put 'em up motion that Bugs Bunny used to do. And it is a nice way to hide blows without moving your feet too much, and you can imagine that it would be a useful strategy that holds up through 30, 40 rounds of bare-knuckle fighting. Jim Corbett was much more about footwork, variously called the dancing master and all sorts of things. A lot of people accused him of being a runner later when he'd beaten Sullivan, because Sullivan was the people's hero, even though he'd been out of the ring for 3 years. And most, nowadays we would know that that's a sign that a fighter's probably not going to do great when he gets back in. But back then, John L. was considered unbeatable. A lot of what Corbett did was to maintain the distance and ask the opponent to step onto him. Similar to how Jack Johnson and Joe Chewinski and people like that are shown to use their jab as a short intercepting weapon to cut and bruise the face as the opponent steps in. He does a really interesting long left hook to the body, which is thrown palm down so that it's like a hook to the head. It's not like a elbow closed shovelly hook to the body. In fact, if you watch George Groves versus Carl Froch, Groves really likes to jab upstairs and then step in with a long, almost full left hook to the sternum in a similar sort of fashion. The whole story of Corbett's career is his lead hand. The jabs, the intercepting jabs, the darting in and out, jabs to the body especially. That's something that's remarked upon in his fight with Sullivan. The jabs to the body, which, even then people were thinking that they weren't a legit punch in the same way that an overhand right was or something like that. But he was able to wind a lot of people with that one. Corbett believed, of course, in the clinch. One of the very first scientific fighters in that sense was happy to tie up if it suited him. This was as we moved away from the era of wrestling, because we're out of the London Prize Rules days and into the Marquess of Queensberry Rules days, which discourage wrestling. But he used the clinch very well to smother opponents and halt attacks. It's always interesting to hear how fighters of the next generation feel about the ability of a fighter previous to them, because a lot of this stuff is hidden by poor camera quality, film quality, early film technology. But Gene Tunney, who was heavyweight champion of the world after Dempsey, he beat Dempsey through beautiful footwork, circling out constantly. Very scientific fighter, but he idolized James Corbett, and they became friends later in life, and they'd playfully spar from time to time. And he said that Corbett was obsessed with movement. He even drew out diagrams and problems like chess problems of footwork. So he was huge on sidestepping as people charged him into corners, which might seem like a standard thing now, but was very rare for a guy to be able to do that consistently back in the day. The fight normally just happened wherever you got caught, but Corbett could control exactly where the fight happened. Tunney himself is interesting because he believed in punching with just the arm. Jack Dempsey used to talk about mechanical men. Tunney believed that you should punch just from the arm and leave your weight and your feet free to move. He thought that punching piston-like just from the arm straight was enough. Allegedly, in 1925, a guy called Grantland Rice convinced Corbett and Tunney to have a little spar, 3 rounds in the gloves. Only 2-minute rounds, because at the time Corbett was nearly 60, and apparently he asked for a pair of long gym pants, because if you've ever seen any footage of Jim Corbett, it's truly bizarre. He has these shorts that show basically his whole arse cheek, or maybe under cheek, like under boob. And it's just so strange that these were the days when like a lady's calf was indecent, but James Corbett's dancing around with his arse cheeks hanging out. So he asks for these longer trousers because he's almost 60, and they spar 3 2-minute rounds, and Tunney's words afterwards apparently were, "I honestly think he's better than Benny Leonard. It was the greatest thing I've ever seen in the ring. I learned plenty." Continuing on the style of James Corbett, there's a fantastic clip of him him playfully demonstrating techniques with Tunney himself, and he shows a technique in the clinch that Daniel Cormier attempted to use against John Jones, using the overhook and then passing the other wrist to the overhooking hand and freeing the other one hand to hit the head while the other hand ties up both arms. Don't know if he ever pulled it off in a fight, but it was a pretty cool little technique, and it was interesting to see Daniel Cormier attempting it almost successfully against John Jones, of all people. Now, the big punch of the day was the cross counter. I mean, it's still a very dangerous punch, but coming out of the bare knuckle period, you still have people like Joe Gans scoring all their big knockouts with cross counters. Cross counter is the looping right hand across the top of the opponent's jab. You slip to the inside of the jab and you throw the right hand over the top. Jim Corbett loved a very strange punch which looks absolutely bizarre if you see it on film. which was to slip inside the jab and throw a long uppercut, almost from behind him, and try and catch the opponent up inside their jab. And this is recounted in the Bob Fitzsimmons fight. The press are saying that it's a ludicrous uppercut and it's missing by a ridiculous distance, except the one time that he caught Fitzsimmons and split his lips open and cut his tongue. And after the fight, Bob Fitzsimmons was like, I don't think I was ever in trouble, except that one punch that he split my lip open with. So he's got this really weird uppercut. And it looks a lot like the Dominic Cruz style bump out to very, very long rear uppercut. And someone asked me about rear uppercuts on the podcast the other week, and I just said don't. But it's a really interesting idea. As someone who loves the cross counter, I've always wanted to play with it, but it's just so dangerous. So Corbett didn't come out of nowhere. He ran through some of the best fighters of his day. He beat Joe Chowinski, who we're going to talk about a lot more in the Jack Johnson episode we do next. And there's a really interesting little bit of sparring between him and Jim Jeffries that I want to touch on film. And he beat Jake Kilrain, obviously the man who Sullivan had won the title from a year before. And then in the search for a shot at Sullivan, Corbett does something very brave, which is going to tie in with the next episode very well. He fought Peter Jackson, and Peter Jackson was called the Black Prince. The hints in the name, he was black. He was from Australia, or spent much of his life there. Fought in England, beat the English champion, was awarded the championship of the British Empire, and he spent most of his career just waiting for Sullivan to finally fight him. And Sullivan flip-flopped on this a lot, like Jim Jeffries did. When you're being asked about it all the time, it's sometimes you're going to give an answer that will maybe leave the door open, but not really mean it. So at one point he said, white men $10,000, Negroes double, which is just an absurd amount of money at the time, $20,000. But even if Jackson had raised it, I don't think he'd have fought him. Most people agree that he probably wouldn't have fought Jackson. And Muldoon, who was a big part of Sullivan's camp and life, later said that it was because he would lose that no one let him fight Jackson. It wasn't just because Jackson was black. Sullivan was very proud of never having fought a black man. Corbett went out of his way to fight Peter Jackson, and it was a real... Well, depending on the account, it was either an amazing battle or a slog, but it could easily have been both because it was 4 hours long. Gloved combat, but no limit on rounds. Number of rounds, that is, rather than time of rounds. So they go for 4 hours, and then the fight is eventually ruled the draw. But, a draw over the guy that Sullivan doesn't want to fight anyway is almost enough. And afterwards, Corbett's friends and backers, they take him out to see Sullivan in the awful play that he's in, and they manage to convince Sullivan to have a playful spar with him for 3 rounds. And Sullivan is so far out of fight shape that he basically talks them down and says it's going to be playful, and to make sure it's playful, allegedly, he insisted that they do it in their evening wear, the suits that they're wearing at the time. But in this sparring session, apparently Corbett saw that he could beat John L. Sullivan. So eventually they set up the match for 1892, September, and Corbett's account of it is amazing. He says that he could tell Sullivan was going to throw his right hand because he'd throw his left hand down and slap his lead leg when he did it, which is just... I've come at this every way in my head, and I can't work out how that is even possible. But obviously John L. was throwing with some heat. And Corbett dances round him, controls him, meets him with the jab every time he steps in, ties him up effectively, even though Sullivan's the bigger, stronger man. And he brings that lack of conditioning to bear on the fight. And eventually, in the 21st round, Sullivan's hit and he goes down to his hands and knees, and he can't beat the count. And he drags himself up by the ropes, and it was Sullivan's style to give a post-fight speech. Even though there were no microphones, he would just bellow to the crowd. He used to say, "Yours, always on the level, John L. Sullivan." Or always on the level, truly yours, John L. Sullivan, depending on who you read. But this time he says, "I fought too long, but I'm glad I was beaten by an American." And then hilariously, in 1913, this guy comes along and says that neither of them are American, both born of Irish parents. Corbett, it was a lot less obvious. He lived up to he didn't conform to those stereotypes at all. He was very proud of the position in society that he achieved by being the world champion. He always wore his suits, and Sullivan loved his suits, but he was apparently a competent actor later on, got into theatre, and was just the love of high society. However, many of the people who loved boxing for John L. Sullivan and for his fighting ability and knockout ability came to hate Corbett because of this, because he danced around the great John L. But then the knockout finish makes it a little bit harder to argue that, you would think. Now, the third champion, and we're only going to touch on him briefly because he's a weird figure, but he's not champion for long, and he's not begrudgingly not accepted as American. He genuinely is not American. But Bob Fitzsimmons is a fantastically interesting character. If you read any account of him, they always say that he had like the upper body of a heavyweight, but no legs at all. He had those John Jones chicken legs. And he was middleweight, and he came over from, he was born in Cornwall. So he was often referred to as the Cornishman, but emigrated to New Zealand, and then eventually his fighting career picked up in Australia. So really a citizen of the world, or at least the empire. Eventually he comes to the United States, and in 1891, a year before Corbett beats Sullivan, he fights Jack the Nonpareil Dempsey for the middleweight championship. And this Jack Dempsey is the Jack Dempsey that the Jack Dempsey we know got his name from. Now, no one can quite decide what kind of fighter Fitz was. Everyone wants to credit him as a sharp puncher, but he was very flat-footed, very plodding at times. What we do know is that he could hit, and hit really well. Jim Jeffries, who ended up beating Fitzsimmons by being enormous, a genuinely huge heavyweight for the day, credited Fitzsimmons as the hardest hitter and the best fighter that he ever fought, and then credited Corbett as the best ring technician. Didn't credit Jack Johnson with anything, but we'll get to that next episode. Fitzsimmons and Corbett did not get along. They very famously almost got into a fight in the lobby of in the bar rather of a hotel. Corbett was staying at the hotel, found out that Fitzsimmons was in the bar, went down to him, confronted him, said, "Let's fight." And Fitzsimmons turned around and said, "I fight in the ring for big sums of money." And this hacked Corbett off, and he lost his temper and started trying to throw punches at him, and the two had to be separated. And it's interesting that Fitzsimmons could get under the skin of old Gentleman Jim like that. Gentleman Jim, who so prided himself on his composure and how he carried himself. But between this and the later encounter with John L. at Jeffries' camp and his behaviour during the Jeffries-Johnson fight, it's fair to say that he had a bit of a temper. So Fitzsimmons, allegedly, his goal was to prove that a middleweight could win the heavyweight title. There was no light heavyweight division at the time. That was created later, and he did go down and win that title, becoming the first man to win 3 titles at different weights. Fitzsimmons was a very famous body hitter, and that had sort of gone out of fashion since the bare-knuckle days. Obviously, we talked about this last time, the bare-knuckle days. If you're going to be bouncing your hands off someone's skull, you've got a better chance of injuring them than if you're trying to dig into the soft spots on the belly, or around the belly and above the belly. Fitzsimmons fights Tom Sharkey, very famously refereed by Wyatt Earp, who drew a gun in the fight and had to be stripped of it. He decks Sharkey with what was either a body blow or a crotch blow, and pandemonium ensues. In 1897, Fitzsimmons finally gets this fight with Jim Corbett, and despite being outweighed by almost 20 pounds, he gets the better of Corbett. Corbett does win most of the fight moving around. The uppercut we talked about landed, split Fitzsimmons' jaw open, but eventually Corbett stands in front of him too long. Fitz fakes the overhand right, steps with his right foot to the outside of Corbett's lead leg, and digs in the left body punch, the famous Fitzsimmons shift. And this got so much attention that Fitzsimmons started saying that he had 47 different shifts he could use. But I mean, this one's the one that's famous, and who knows if he did, but he probably didn't. And He put Corbett down for the count, won the title. Now, Fitzsimmons is an interesting character in his own right because he then went down to light heavyweight after he lost his heavyweight title to Jim Jeffries. He'd rumoured that he was going to retire as soon as he won the title from Corbett. He didn't offer Corbett a rematch. Corbett was furious about that. And Fitzsimmons basically fights forever after this. His last fight is in 1914. If you look in, I was reading the papers from around Johnson's time, and there's a lot of discussion over whether Fitzsimmons should be stopped for his own good. Fitzsimmons eventually lost to Jim Jeffries, who we're going to get into a lot more next week. But it is interesting that those first three heavyweight champions of the world, two of them really are Americans. They grew up in America, they considered themselves Americans, and they were pretty patriotic about it. But if you really want to go back and try and pick people out, it's very easy to do in a nation of people who have immigrated there. Fitzsimmons is an example of someone who was a first-generation immigrant. You know, he moved over to the United States when he wanted a world title, and he successfully won 3 while there. And each of them achieved social mobility through their boxing. Even though Corbett wasn't particularly hard done by from birth, he was able to become the toast of high society and improve his financial prospects. But really, the sport of boxing at this time is picking up followers. More people are taking part in it. The gloved era is making it into more of a sport than a spectacle. And while we aren't at the point of popularity that we were with John L. Sullivan, the argument for it being a sport is a lot easier when you have technicians like James Corbett and guys like Bob Fitzsimmons floating around, proving that technicians or the smaller man can overcome, or the technician overcomes the bruiser. However, it is safe to say that the height of popularity up to this point was with John L. Sullivan, and boxing is going to find popularity like that again shortly, and very soon it's going to become the be-all and end-all of life for a very short period. And then those same Americans who don't really want to accept the Irish immigrants are going to almost outright ban boxing to keep a quote-unquote Ethiopian champion from plying his trade. But that's all for next time. Give me a shout what you think about what we did this episode. I'm really enjoying having the footage of these fighters to work with now. It's always nice to have a loose theme to go through these guys in some sort of order, and I hope to tie this theme together a little bit better in the next part. Thanks, as always, for all your support. I couldn't do the podcast without you. You really are wonderful to me. And if you want any sort of historical storylines or technical stuff for future episodes, give me a shout on Patreon, Twitter, wherever, and I'll try and make it happen. Cheers.